Hi there, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to take a look at what macros and shortcuts I use. I've had a bunch of people ask me to make a video about it, so I thought, yeah, why not? Let's do it. So I hope you find it useful and let's dive right in. So as you can see, I use a Stream Deck, namely the Stream Deck XL, instead of an iPad. I don't like iPads or tablets in general. On one hand, I do prefer the tactile sensation of pressing a button, but also buttons have the advantage that if you memorize where everything is, where every button is, you don't have to look at which button you're pressing every time, which is not the case with iPads, where you always have to look at which button you are tapping. Now let's look at the macros themselves. First off, it might come across as a bit chaotic in that you're going to see that there's lots of macros, lots of buttons that can be found in different places, in lots of different places in my Stream Deck. This has to do with optimizing navigation within the Stream Deck, meaning not having to go in and out of lots of folders and subfolders in order to find that button that I need. This is because even though there are lots of macros, lots of buttons, there are certain macros that you use all the time, whereas there are others that you use every now and again or barely at all. So that is why having quick access to those that you use constantly is paramount in your workflow. So if we start from the top left, these two control output gain. This one simply opens Logic, and these two arrows are 7 notches in a row, both to the left and to the right. This is actually quite simple, but quite useful in that if you want to nudge something for, a bit of a stretch, instead of having to constantly press the same shortcut over and over again, you just hit the button once and that's it. Under this subfolder called main, we find certain key commands that I usually need to use once or barely a few times in each project. There are create marker, lock marker, unlock marker, activate scrolling play, show unselected tracks, import movie, open sync settings, and open audio project settings. If we go back to the previous window, there is this ARR button, which basically directs me to the arrangement tracks. If you have watched my previous video about my template, you'll remember that I use several piano tracks to lay out my arrangements, from which then I copy the MIDI data onto each individual track. This means that I need to go back to the arrangement tracks all the time. And even though I have a separate monitor where I keep separate piano roll windows for each individual arrangement track, quickly being able to go back to the arrangement tracks area and select different combinations of arrangement tracks, or maybe all of them, is very useful. What the next button does is copy the MIDI data from the CC1 lane and paste it onto the CC11 lane. This is very useful because even though what CC1 and CC11 are doing at any given time is not always the same, more often than not, it's somewhere close, especially if you're writing orchestral music. So for instance, if you draw an automation line on CC1, instead of having to draw from scratch a similar automation line on CC11, you can just copy and paste what you previously drew and then just tweak it, which is much faster. The way to do this in Logic is through MIDI transform functions, which is an amazing tool, by the way. You can do so much with it. It can get a bit complicated, but it's definitely worth investing a bit of time in learning how it works and how it can help your workflow. So the shortcut you see here is simply the shortcut I have assigned to that specific MIDI transform function. The next button directly underneath is the opposite of the previous one, so it copies data from the CC11 lane and pastes it onto the CC1 lane. The one to the left copies CC1 data and pastes it onto CC106, which is the CC I have assigned to vibrato. The same way it happened with the previous two buttons, many times the automation line I want the vibrato lane to follow is somewhat similar to what CC1 is doing, so having the same starting point as what CC1 is doing is very useful. The next button increases by 8 the velocity or the CC data that you select. This is incredibly useful and spares you so many clicks. And if you're a person like me that struggles with tendinitis on their forearm, it's a lifesaver. In fact, it is sparing myself as many clicks as possible, what drives the necessity of creating buttons all the time, most of the time at least, because I really struggle with tendinitis. The button underneath does the opposite in that it reduces the velocity or CC selected by 8. The next one selects all CC1 data and increases it by 8. And the one underneath, the opposite, so it selects all CC1 data and decreases it by 8. The next two buttons in blue do the exact same as the previous two, but applied to CC11. So it selects all CC11 data and increases it or decreases it by 8. The next two buttons are very similar to the ones we saw, the velocity/CC ones. But in this case, instead of increasing or decreasing the value by 8 at a time, they do so on a percentage basis, in this case by a 10%. These are particularly important when it comes to emphasizing or de-emphasizing contrast. Like, for instance, you might have an automation line that you like, but you want a bit more of a swell. So by just upscaling the whole picture, the whole drawing by 10%, you create that contrast. And here's a little combo I use all the time, as if this was a video game. If you reach 127, which is the limit for CC, but you want to increase that contrast even further, what I do is to reduce the global amount, the global MIDI data, by 8 at a time, and then I keep increasing it by 10%. Because as far as I'm aware, in Logic, there's no way to upscale/downscale MIDI data around a pivot. I think you can do that in Cubase, but not in Logic, or at least I'm not aware of it. If there's a way, you know a way, please let me know in the comments. So moving on to the last column, the one at the bottom, velocity 1, that's what it means. It basically sets the velocity value to 1, very simple. The next one immediately above sets it to 50, and the one on top of it sets it to 127. These are particularly useful when it comes to writing orchestral music, especially values like 1, 50, 127, in order to quickly trigger a type of legato transition or a type of attack. They usually sit at the very bottom or at the very top of the CC range. Finally, the last button in this page forces a legato, and it is made up by 3 different steps. The first one bridges the gap between notes. The second one extends the length of those notes so they overlap. And finally, the last one makes sure that there is no overlap between 2 notes that are the same. Now let's move on to the next layer, which is in the navigation folder. First, let's take a look at these 4 buttons which control the video, the film that I import into Logic. In my sessions, when I import a film into Logic, I place that audio for that video on this track called Video Track. And as you may have guessed, these 4 buttons control that track. So at the click of a button, literally, I can either solo, unsolo, mute, unmute, and control the volume for that track. The way I do this is by first making these buttons send MIDI data and then assigning that MIDI data to normal controller assignments within Logic. In order to make a button send MIDI data, there is a free plugin that you can download for your Stream Deck called literally MIDI. And then you can just drag and drop a generic MIDI function and set it up like this, like you are seeing. In this case, I've selected CC21 for solo, I've selected CC22 for mute, and for the slider, I've selected CC20. Then in order to sort out the controller assignment, first off, you have to open the controller assignment window, which in my case, the shortcut is Shift-Alt-K. And finally, then you just have to first click the function that you want to assign, then click Learn Mode. And immediately after that, you press the button that you want to be assigned to that function. And then just simply click Learn Mode again to switch it off, and that's it. Also, it is very important to pin the function to the track that you want to target. So make sure that here in the channel strip dialog, you select the pinned to then the track that you want to target. When it comes to the slider, make sure you select the fader button type. And then you just set it up like this. You can customize the way it looks and stuff. And in order to set up the controller assignment, simply click at the fader in Logic and then hit learn mode and then press one of the buttons and then again switch off the learn mode, make sure that it is pinned to the right channel, and yeah, that's it. One final word of caution here, always make sure that the input is the right one. I have found that for some reason, sometimes Logic assigns the control assignment to a different device. If you've got several devices that send MIDI data, yeah, always make sure that the input is your Stream Deck, is the one that you are sending the MIDI data from. Now let's move on to these groups folder. And what all these buttons do is send me to each of these instruments buses and open the automation lane. If you don't know what I'm referring to, please check out the video I made about my template. But basically what it is that I've got a funnel for each instrument, funneling all patches and tracks that have to do with that instrument. So for instance, all flutes, legatos, long, shorts, all of them are funneled, are routed to this flute bus. And the same applies to all the other instruments. If we move on to the next folder over, what all these buttons do is solo all instruments buses. This is very useful if, for instance, you are tweaking a complex arrangement at some point you want to solo the hobos or the second violins. At the click of a button, without having to look up the track or anything, you just have them soloed, do what you have to do and solo them and move on. And the way I do this is by turning these buttons into generic MIDI modules and then have them assigned to the specific track that they correspond to. The same way I did with the video track buttons. The next folder over, called instrument mute, does the exact same thing as the solo, but with mute. So basically I can mute any single instrument bus I want at any given time at the click of a button. Super useful. The next folder over is called stereo out. And basically what it does is go to the stereo out channel and then load the plugin I want. Moving on to the next folder, which is called plugins. Here is basically an assortment of certain plugins that I use a lot or more than others. And what it basically does, each button is to load up that plugin. I also have 3 macros that create additional channels for reverb and delay. I find that these change a lot from project to project. Sometimes you need like 5 delays, sometimes you need 3, etc. And the same with reverb. So these are very useful. The last folder in the bottom right, which is called MIDI CC channel change, has got a bunch of new buttons. What all these green background buttons do is change the channel of all MIDI data in a given MIDI region. So for instance, if I draw an automation line on channel 1 and I want to copy the exact same MIDI region onto a different instrument, but that articulation that I want to trigger is in a different MIDI channel, I just at the click of a button can turn the exact same automation onto a different MIDI channel, which is very useful. Next is these 2 buttons, the master one and the stereo out, and what they do is simply direct me to each of these channels. Finally, the rest of all buttons are basically navigation buttons and buttons that we have already seen, so let's go over them very quickly. Under this first woodwinds folder, we find several subfolders that give me quick access to several instruments. So for instance, I can quickly select the bassoon legato channel or the flute shorts channel at the click of a button without having to scroll, without having to look up anything. It's very, very useful. The exact same principle applies to brass, applies to strings, to all my orchestral layering patches, etc, etc. So basically this spares me a lot of scrolling, a lot of having to look up instruments, clicks, spares me a lot of clicks, and all in all makes my workflow faster, more comfortable. It also reduces friction tremendously, and that also helps creativity. But at the end of the day, keep in mind that all these are very personal and they are particularly tailored to my workflow, which may or may not align with yours. At any rate, I hope you found this video helpful, and please let me know if you've got any questions in the comments down below. And yeah, see you in the next one. Cheers.